I'm going to keep things really simple today. I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction to the backdrop to the report, and then, of course, the main findings of the report. Then we have two really great speakers here today to help answer your questions. We have Adam Bailey, who is the spokesman for Iran International, whose journalists have very much been affected by the sorts of things we're going to be talking about today. And I have also here with us Nazanin Ansari, who is a very experienced Iranian journalist based in London, and the managing editor of Kayhan London and Kayhan Life, who will be able to give us a sort of first-hand view of what it's like being an Iranian journalist outside Iran. The session is being recorded, as noted. I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions. I know that all of you will have slightly different requirements for your various publications. The backdrop to this report, the immediate backdrop, the sort of news backdrop, if you like, you're probably aware of because there's been quite a lot of movement on this topic and quite a bit of press coverage in the last few weeks. Just under 3 weeks ago, a journalist from Iran International was stabbed in London. A stabbing, we don't yet know the motive of that stabbing or who conducted it, but obviously that was something deeply alarming for all the journalists at Iran International and more widely, coming on the back of a forced closure last year of Iran International because of a high level of threat. You may also have seen that just yesterday, the BBC submitted an updated urgent appeal to the United Nations about this topic, the treatment of its journalists, asking for the United Nations to take urgent action. So those are kind of the news backdrop. There is, of course, though, a much longer tail to this story. Iran has been repressing journalists for decades. Inside Iran, the situation is really dire for journalists. And there's been an escalation of repression of journalists since the start of the Women Life Freedom movement in 2022. 87 journalists inside Iran have been arrested since those protests began. As we sit here today, 20 journalists are in prison in Iran. Iran last year in RSF's World Press Freedom Index was 177 out of 180 countries. So it really is one of the worst countries in the world for journalists to operate. But alongside that domestic repression, Iran has for a very long time been also systematically targeting journalists who report on Iran from abroad in an effort to silence them. The aim in both cases, in both the domestic case and the external case, what we'd call a transnational case, is to stop citizens in Iran from getting information about what is happening. So it's part and parcel of the same thing, what I refer to in the report as a continuum of repression that begins inside Iran but reaches well beyond. So that targeting of journalists abroad is a form of what we would refer to as transnational repression. It's a bit of a political buzzword these last few years. What it is, simply put, is the practice of governments reaching across borders to target people they see as opponents or critics abroad. The range of tactics that Iran uses against journalists abroad is really wide. It includes, among other things, physical attacks, detentions, defamation, asset freezes, the harassment of family members who are still inside Iran, physical threats and harassment, judicial proceedings, intrusive surveillance. And in addition to those sorts of fairly traditional methods of repression, in recent years have been added a slew of digital techniques, most notably threats and intimidation delivered online. At RSF, for many years, we've been documenting cases of Iranian journalists around the world who are subject to this kind of repression. For example, in 2020, we counted about 200 journalists in countries as wide apart as the US, Sweden, Netherlands, Germany, France, who've been receiving online threats, including death threats. You may also have seen over years some very high-profile cases, for example, the 2022 kidnapping plot in the states of Masih Alinejad, or in 2020, the journalist Ruhollah Zam, who was brought back to Iran and executed. So every now and again, there's a story that kind of breaks through. But it's something we've been concerned about for a very long time. So the UK, and London specifically, has become a real hotspot for these kinds of attacks, for this kind of repression, because of the presence here of major Persian language broadcast platforms. BBC News Persian has been broadcasting a television channel since 2009. Since 2017, we've had Iran International, also based in London. And until recently, there was a third major broadcaster, Monoto, which is still operational online, but no longer broadcast since the beginning of this year. There are also a number of smaller publications with a large reach back in Iran, including Nazanin's organization, platform, Kayhan. So we have a really large number of Iranian journalists in London, which is what makes it a center really for this kind of repression that we're talking about, and is the reason why we decided to use London as a sort of case study when we were investigating this issue more deeply and putting together this report. So to the report's main findings. Quick word on methodology. We conducted an extensive survey last year of journalists across platforms, across different employers and freelance journalists as well. We also did 24 in-depth interviews, long interviews with Iranian journalists, their employers, and people who work with them. There was a large literature survey as well, a survey of existing reports and literature, and also some freedom of information requests. So a lot of different sorts of reporting went into the report itself. What we found briefly, sort of as an overview, is that the level of threat is really unprecedented and that it comes at enormous professional and personal cost. The journalists, I should say, at all of these outlets show enormous resilience and courage. But the bottom line is that even though they're working in a country which says it champions press freedom, they're not able to work freely and without fear. So a few of the main findings of the report. Online attacks have risen exponentially. So about 90%, just under 90% of the journalists surveyed said that they had experienced online threats or harassment in the last 5 years. 50% of them, so half the journalists, said they received them frequently. Those online threats include death threats, they include rape threats, there are phishing attempts, impersonation attempts, cyber attacks, a whole range of digital techniques, delivered personally, delivered publicly. Second, many attacks are gendered. So women are particularly likely to be on the receiving end of abuse online, receiving messages that are often sexualized, misogynistic, or defamatory. So there is a very gendered aspect, especially when we're talking about the online aspects of the abuse. The harassment of family members back in Iran continues on a very large scale. Around 60% of the journalists who answered our survey said that their families had experienced threats or intimidation related to their work as journalists. So a very high proportion. And this technique of targeting families in order to put pressure on the journalists to stop doing their work. Fourth, the impact on journalists and on journalism is really devastating. The journalists we spoke to spoke of the impacts of really this sustained exposure. This is something that is happening to them daily, day in, day out, week in, week out, month in, month out. They talked of anxiety, suicidal thoughts, hypervigilance, disruption to their family lives, exhaustion, sleeplessness, isolation. So 3/4 of our survey respondents said they'd experienced psychological stress, anxiety, or feelings of vulnerability because of the threats and harassment that they're exposed to. The impact on journalism that comes from that is also huge. Journalists talked about self-censorship. They talked about needing time off work, leaving social media platforms, trying not to be so exposed, which of course has enormous professional repercussions given how much of journalism takes place on social media these days. And some reported leaving work altogether. So a very clear impact on journalism as well as on individual journalists. The threat, it's important to say, comes from multiple actors. What we have found is that the Iranian government and its proxies are the principal source of threats and harassment, but they are not the only one. In the last 10 years, there has been a rise in harassment from opposition groups, from political activists, from other members of the Iranian diaspora who maybe accuse the journalists of being sympathetic, for example, to the regime. So for journalists who are on the receiving end of this kind of abuse, it feels very much like it's coming from all directions. Finally, before I hand to our speakers, the response of authorities has often been inadequate. The report sets out clear recommendations, policy recommendations for government, for police and other law enforcement agencies, and also for social media platforms, who are a big piece of the puzzle and have been woefully inadequate in their response. As the report sets out, the response from government and police has been mixed. At times, there has been a strong response, especially when there are sort of high-profile, large cases. But on an individual level, journalists feel let down. There are a lot more things that can be done to protect journalists, to support them, and to ensure that those responsible are held to account. And the report very clearly sets out the recommendations that we are calling for. There's so much more we could talk about. There's so much detail in the report that I can direct you towards as well. In particular, on the impact, I'd recommend that you read section 4, which really details the sorts of things that journalists and journalism are experiencing.